husband of 41 years handed me a folder across the kitchen table on a Sunday evening and told me to sign it by Friday. He said he'd been very fair. I looked at the folder. I looked at him, and I thought, this man has been sleeping in the same bed with me since 1983, and right now he cannot meet my eyes. I didn't sign, not that Friday, not the one after, and by the time I was done, he wished I had. Good evening, everyone. This is Sarah. Welcome back to Sarah's Stories. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found me. Please stay until the end and drop me a comment telling me what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Tonight I want to tell you about the year I turned 71 and discovered that the man I'd spent my entire adult life building a future with had been quietly dismantling it behind my back. This is not a story about bitterness. I want you to know that up front. This is a story about what happens when a woman who's been underestimated her whole life finally decides to stop being quiet about it. Let me start at the beginning. My husband's name is Thomas. We met in 1981 at a company picnic in Savannah, Georgia, where I'd just started working as a receptionist for a mid-size insurance company. He was in the actuarial department. Handsome in a quiet, serious way, he brought me a Dixie cup of lemonade without being asked, and I thought, this one pays attention. I was wrong about that, eventually. But for a long time, I wasn't. We married in June of 1983. I was 29. He was 32. We moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, when his firm offered him a regional director position, and I put my own ambitions. I'd been taking night classes toward an accounting degree, on hold to make the move easier. Just temporarily, I told myself. Just until we get settled. We had 2 children. Our daughter Renee came first, then our son Kevin 3 years later. I stayed home with them when they were small because the math made sense. Childcare would have eaten most of my salary, and by the time they were school age, Thomas's career had grown into something that required a full partner behind it. Dinners for clients, moves to keep up with promotions, a social calendar I managed down to the last detail. I was good at it, genuinely good. I kept the household running like a clock, kept our finances organized, kept his mother comfortable in her last years when she couldn't manage on her own anymore. What I did not keep was my own name on the deed to our house. I'm getting to that. For most of our marriage, I would have told you we were happy. Not firecracker happy, not the kind of happiness you see in movies, but solid, steady, the kind of life where you know what to expect and that feels like a gift. Thomas wasn't effusive, but he was reliable. He remembered anniversaries. He called when he was running late. He was a good father, if not a warm one. Then he turned 68, and something shifted. I noticed it the way you notice a smell in a house. Not all at once, but in small moments that add up. He started going to the gym, which he hadn't done in 15 years. He bought new clothes without mentioning it, things I found folded in the back of the closet with the tags still on. He began taking calls in the garage and coming back inside with his face deliberately neutral, the way a person looks when they've just rehearsed it. I told myself I was reading into things. 41 years of marriage earns you some faith. Then came the work conference in Raleigh. Thomas had attended this conference every year for a decade. He always came home Sunday evening with a stack of brochures he'd never look at again, and a dry recap of whatever panel he'd sat through. That year he came home Monday. Said the conference ran long. Seemed distracted for days afterward, checking his phone in a way I hadn't seen before, angling it slightly away from me, the screen dimming before I could register anything. I mentioned it once. Just once. He told me I was being paranoid. Maybe I was, but I started paying attention in a different way after that. I noticed the credit card statements had a new line. Charges at a restaurant called Fig and Barrel in Raleigh, a Tuesday evening in April when Thomas had told me he was in Charlotte for a client meeting. I noticed receipts for Nordstrom stuffed into the pocket of a coat I sent to the dry cleaner. I noticed that when I asked about our investment portfolio one afternoon, just a casual question, something about whether we should move some money before year end, he changed the subject so smoothly I almost didn't notice he'd done it. I was still doing his laundry when I found the note. It was on a folded piece of paper tucked into the breast pocket of his navy blazer. Just a first name and a phone number. Diane. The handwriting was feminine, the letters looping and careful. He'd carried this into my house, in a pocket I'd emptied and filled 100 times. I put the note back. I didn't say anything. I sat down at the kitchen table after he left for work, and I thought for a long time about what kind of woman I was going to be in whatever came next. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning in October. I'd made French toast, his favourite, and we were sitting across from each other the way we always did, with the newspaper and our coffee, when he looked up and said, "Dorothy, I think we need to talk about our future." I set down my fork. He had a whole speech prepared. I could tell because he didn't stumble once, didn't pause the way he usually did when he was working something out. He'd rehearsed this. He talked about growing apart, about needing space to figure out who he was in this last chapter of his life, about how we'd both be happier, ultimately. I said, "Thomas, are you asking me for a divorce?" He said yes. I didn't cry. I don't know why. I think some part of me had been waiting for this moment long enough that when it arrived, I just went very still. He slid the folder across the table. His attorney had drawn up a proposed settlement. The house, the 4-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Drive that I had furnished, repainted, repaired and landscaped over 22 years, was in Thomas's name. He was offering to let me take my personal belongings and a settlement of $1,400 a month. He would keep the house, the 2 cars, the investment accounts, the vacation property in Brevard, North Carolina that we'd bought together 12 years ago with money I'd helped save. He said, and I remember this clearly because I'd turned it over many times since, "I've been more than fair, Dorothy. You'll be comfortable." After 41 years, he was offering me comfortable. I said, "I'll need some time to review this." He nodded, relieved I wasn't making a scene, said, "Take a week, but don't drag it out. The lawyer says the sooner we file, the cleaner it is." That night I sat at the kitchen table alone for 3 hours. I did not let myself fall apart, not fully. I gave myself 20 minutes to cry, actually timed it on the microwave clock, and then I dried my face, poured a second cup of coffee and opened that folder. The legal language was dense, but I understood enough. Thomas got everything we had built together, every asset we'd accumulated in 4 decades of partnership, and I would walk away with $1,400 a month and whatever I could fit in my car. I called Renee the next morning. She answered on the second ring. I could hear her daughter playing in the background. When I told her, there was a long silence. Then she said, "Mom, I knew something was wrong. He's been weird for months. He missed Lily's birthday dinner and barely apologized." I asked her to think carefully. Had she seen anything, noticed anything? She hesitated. Then she said, "There's a woman from his firm. Younger, maybe early 40s. She was at the company Christmas party last December. Dad introduced her as his colleague, but the way she laughed at everything he said, Mum, I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure. I thanked her. I told her not to say anything to her father yet, and I told her I was not signing those papers. I didn't need a divorce attorney, not yet. What I needed first was information. Renee found me a forensic accountant through her friend's husband, a man who'd used him during a business dispute. His name was Raymond Okafor. His office was in uptown Charlotte, quiet and professional. On the 14th floor of a building I'd driven past 100 times without ever having a reason to go inside. He shook my hand and said, "Tell me what you know." I told him everything. The changes in Thomas, the note, the conference in Raleigh, the credit card charges, the investment conversation Thomas had deflected. When I mentioned that I'd been managing our household accounts for years and had begun noticing transfers I couldn't account for, Raymond leaned forward. Do you have access to statements? Joint accounts? Anything? I manage our household checking and the joint savings, I said. Thomas handles the investment accounts and the brokerage, but I see the monthly summaries, and lately the numbers haven't been adding up the way they used to. Raymond nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitfield, I want to be honest with you. If your husband has been moving marital assets, I can find it. But it takes time, and when he realizes you're looking, things may get uncomfortable. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the folder on my kitchen table, the offer of $1,400 a month after 41 years. I said, I am absolutely prepared for that. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a different version of myself. I photographed every document I could access, bank statements, transfer records, the investment summaries Thomas left on his desk. I created an email account he didn't know about and sent everything to Raymond. I went through the filing cabinet in Thomas's home office. Our home office, I corrected myself every time I felt like a trespasser in my own house, and photographed the folders he kept in the back behind a stack of old tax returns. Thomas noticed I'd gone quiet. I could see him watching me at dinner, trying to read what I was thinking. One evening he asked, Have you looked at the papers? I said, I'm still reviewing my options. His jaw tightened. Dorothy, I don't want this to get adversarial. I said, Neither do I. I'm being thorough. He didn't like that answer, but he couldn't argue with it. Raymond called me 12 days later. Come in, he said. I found something. The drive to his office felt very long. He spread documents across the conference table and said, Mrs. Whitfield, does the name Carver Ridge Holdings mean anything to you? I frowned. No. Your husband registered it as an LLC in Delaware 14 months ago. He is the sole member. Over the past year, he has transferred a total of approximately $230,000 from accounts that constitute marital property into accounts held by Carver Ridge. I felt the room tilt slightly. That money, Raymond continued, has been used for a variety of expenses, property searches, renovations or a condominium in Asheville that is held in Carver Ridge's name, travel, jewelry purchases, the condominium in Asheville, not the Brevard cabin we'd bought together. Something new. Something I didn't know existed. Can we prove all of this? I asked. We can, Raymond said. But Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to understand what you're dealing with. This is not just divorce positioning. This is the intentional concealment of marital assets. In North Carolina, that matters. A judge takes it seriously. I said, Then let's make sure the judge knows. That evening Thomas came home from work to find me sitting in the living room, very still, the folder from his attorney open on the coffee table. He looked at it, looked at me. Ready to sign? He asked, and there was something almost relieved in his voice. I said, I have a question first, about Carver Ridge Holdings. The colour left his face so fast it was almost interesting to watch. He stopped. Started again. That's a business matter. Nothing to do with the divorce settlement. It seems like quite a lot of our money has been going there, I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. Thomas's expression shifted. You've been going through my private accounts. Our accounts, I said. We're still married, Thomas. Community property applies. He took a step toward me and I held my ground. Dorothy, he said, and his voice had dropped into something harder. Sign those papers. Take what's offered. Don't make this into something you can't walk back from. Or what? I asked. He didn't answer, but I saw it in his eyes, the assumption that I would blink first, that I always had. I didn't blink. The next morning I retained my own attorney. Her name was Carol Spate. She was 63 years old, had practiced family law in Charlotte for 30 years, and came recommended by Raymond as someone who did not lose cases involving hidden assets. When I sat across from her and laid out everything, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, We're going to file first. Our terms, not his. When Thomas was served at his office 2 days later, he called me 4 times. I didn't pick up. Carol called me instead with a calm update. The accounts had been frozen pending full disclosure. A motion had been filed to include Carver Ridge Holdings in the marital estate, and Thomas's attorney had already called her office twice that morning. Thomas came home that evening like a weather system. He didn't knock, just pushed through the back door into the kitchen where I was making soup. "Dorothy," he said. His voice was shaking. "You froze everything. Do you understand what you've done? I have bills. I have obligations." "You have obligations to me," I said. 41 years of them. He stood at the end of the kitchen island, and I saw the man I'd married somewhere inside the face in front of me, and it didn't move me the way I'd expected. I felt something cooler than grief, a kind of steadiness I hadn't known I had. "You're not going to win this," he said. "My lawyer says your case has no standing. That money went into Carver Ridge before we filed. It's—" "Carol says otherwise," I said. "We'll let the judge decide." He left. Not from the house. I haven't changed the locks yet. That came later. But from the room. He went upstairs and I heard him pacing, heard the low, urgent murmur of a phone call, and I turned back to my soup and waited. The text came 3 days later from a number I didn't recognize. "You should take what he offered you. Before this gets worse." No signature. It didn't need one. Carol filed it as evidence immediately. "Harassment," she said, and filed for a restraining order. "They're rattled," she told me. "Good. I changed the locks the following week. Kevin flew in from Denver when Renee told him what was happening. He showed up at my door with a duffel bag and a rental car and said, 'Mum, I'm staying as long as you need me.' I hadn't expected that. I sat at the kitchen table and cried for the first time in weeks, not from grief exactly, but from the relief of not being alone in it anymore. He listened to everything. He asked good questions. When I explained about Carver Ridge, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 'There's a woman from his office who commented on all his LinkedIn posts last spring. I saw it when I was looking at something else. I didn't think anything of it. Renee had her name. Diane. The same Diane from the note in the blazer pocket. Her full name was Diane Marsh. She was 44. She had joined Thomas's firm 3 years ago as a senior underwriter. She was, apparently, the reason my husband had bought new clothes and started going to the gym and stopped being able to look at me across the breakfast table. She was also, I learned this from Raymond, who had continued pulling threads, the person whose name appeared on the interior design invoices for the Asheville condominium that Thomas had purchased with our money. I sat with that for a long time. Thomas's attorney called me on a Wednesday afternoon, and to his credit he kept the pretense going almost convincingly. He said Thomas was open to revising the settlement. He was willing to consider a larger monthly payment, perhaps $1,800, and a provision that would let me remain in the house for up to 18 months while I made other arrangements. All I needed to do was withdraw the Carver Ridge filing and agree not to pursue any claims against the funds already transferred. I said I'd need to speak with my attorney. Carol's response, when I called her, was 4 words: "Don't you dare." She explained what the offer meant. It meant Raymond had found enough to scare them. It meant Thomas knew that if a judge reviewed the full picture, the LLC, the condominium, the transfers, the jewelry receipts, the proposed settlement of $1,400 a month was going to look like exactly what it was, an attempt to defraud a spouse of 41 years. I called Thomas's attorney back the next morning and declined. The silence on his end of the line was almost satisfying. There was one more night before the hearing. Thomas came by the house. Carol had the restraining order, but she'd advised me that enforcing it fully would mean a scene that might unsettle the judge's first impression, so I had agreed he could collect some personal items with 24 hours' notice. He came with a rolling suitcase and moved through the bedroom carefully, efficiently, the way someone moves in a house they're no longer sure they're welcome in. I stayed in the kitchen. When he came downstairs, he stopped in the doorway. He looked for a moment like the man who'd handed me a Dixie cup of lemonade at a company picnic in Savannah 43 years ago, tired and a little uncertain. "Dorothy," he said, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much right now, but I am." I thought about what I'd imagined I'd feel hearing those words. I'd expected some kind of fracturing, some last surge of grief. What I felt instead was very clear. I said, "I believe you're sorry, Thomas. I believe you're sorry things ended up here. But you're not sorry you did it. You're sorry it didn't work out the way you planned." He didn't argue. He picked up his suitcase and he left. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in March. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Thomas sat with 2 attorneys. I sat with Carol, who was wearing the navy blazer I'd come to think of as her armor. Raymond was present as an expert witness, his documents organized in color-coded binders. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Simmons. She was somewhere in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and an expression that suggested she had heard every version of every story and was not easily impressed. Carl presented the case methodically. The marital estate, properly calculated. The Carver Ridge LLC. The $230,000 transferred from joint assets. The Asheville condominium, purchased with marital funds, held in Thomas's sole name through a shell company, currently being used, per Raymond's documentation, as a residence by Diane Marsh. Thomas's lead attorney objected at every turn, contested the characterization of the LLC, argued the transfers predated the decision to divorce, argued Thomas's higher lifetime earnings gave him greater claim to the portfolio. Judge Simmons let them finish. Then she said, "Mr. Pardio, Hollins, is your client prepared to explain why he established a limited liability company 14 months ago and transferred a significant portion of marital assets into it without his spouse's knowledge?" Thomas's attorney said something about business planning. Judge Simmons looked over her glasses. "Is that so?" Carol called Raymond to the stand. He walked through the numbers the way an engineer explains a bridge, clearly, precisely, without drama. The transfers, the invoices, the timeline that showed Thomas had begun positioning his finances for this divorce, well before he'd handed me that folder at the kitchen table. While Raymond was speaking, I heard the door in the back of the courtroom open. I didn't turn around, but Carol leaned slightly toward me and said very quietly, "Diane Marsh just walked in." I didn't look. I kept my eyes forward. Judge Simmons had questions, specific, pointed questions that suggested she had read the filings carefully. At one point she asked Thomas directly. He had taken the stand by then, looking rumpled and smaller than I'd seen him in years, whether he had disclosed the existence of Carver Ridge Holdings during the initial settlement negotiations. He said he hadn't believed it was relevant. Judge Simmons took off her glasses. "Mr. Whitfield, you transferred $230,000 of marital assets into an account you did not disclose during settlement negotiations, and you did not believe it was relevant." Thomas's attorney started to rise. Judge Simmons held up one hand without looking at him. "Sit down, Mr. Hollins." She made notes for a long moment. Then she said, "I've heard enough to issue a preliminary ruling today." She ordered all marital assets frozen pending full forensic audit. She ordered Thomas to pay temporary spousal support of $4,000 per month, effective immediately. She ruled that the Asheville condominium, purchased with documented marital funds, was to be included in the marital estate regardless of the title structure, and she noted, in language Carol later told me was unusually direct, that the court viewed the establishment of Carver Ridge Holdings as a deliberate attempt to circumvent equitable distribution. Thomas's face had gone the colour of old cement. We reconvened 6 weeks later for the final division. In those 6 weeks a few things happened. Thomas's firm launched its own internal audit after Raymond's testimony reached the compliance department through channels I did not fully understand but did not object to. They found that Thomas had, over several years, directed a handful of client accounts toward a third-party vendor in which he held an undisclosed financial interest. It was not criminal in the way the Meridian situation had been in the video I'd once watched about a woman named Margaret. It was a civil matter, a violation of fiduciary duty. but it was enough to accelerate his retirement, involuntarily, and to expose him to a civil suit from the firm. Diane Marsh moved out of the Asheville condominium 2 weeks after the preliminary hearing. I heard this from Kevin, who heard it from a mutual acquaintance of Thomas's. She relocated to Atlanta. Thomas's calls to her, Kevin had noted, appeared to have stopped around the same time. At the final hearing, Judge Simmons reviewed Raymond's completed audit. She was brief and direct. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "after 41 years of marriage and in light of the documented concealment of marital assets, the court finds you are entitled to equitable distribution as follows. I received the house outright, the mortgage to be satisfied from Thomas's share of the asset division. I received 60% of all retirement and investment accounts. I received the full value of the Carver Ridge assets, including the Asheville condominium, which was to be liquidated, and the proceeds divided with me receiving 70% given the documented fraud in its acquisition. I received spousal support of $5,000 monthly for 10 years, and Thomas was ordered to pay my legal fees in full, which had reached $68,000. Thomas sat very still through the reading. He did not look at me. When it was over, his attorney said something quietly to him, and he nodded once mechanically. I stood up and smoothed my jacket and walked out into the March sunlight, with Carol on one side and Kevin, who had come from Denver again, on the other. Kevin said, "Mum, he stopped. You just completely." I said, "Let's get lunch. I haven't eaten since 5 this morning." It took another 4 months to finalize all the transfers, the sale of the Asheville property, the restructuring of accounts. During that time I stayed in the house on Birchwood Drive, and I began, quietly, practically, planning what came next. I sold the house. I know that might seem strange after everything I'd done to keep it, but once the legal battle was over, I walked through those rooms, and what I felt was not warmth. It was the weight of a life that had been built for someone who no longer existed, in a partnership that had been a lie for longer than I'd known. The kitchen where he told me to sign, the bedroom where he'd angled his phone away from me in the dark, the dining room where we'd hosted 30 years of holiday dinners I'd cooked and arranged and cleaned up alone. I didn't want to live inside that. I bought a condominium in Asheville, different from the one Thomas had purchased with my money, something chosen entirely by me, with mountain views and a farmer's market 2 blocks away and neighbours who didn't know a single thing about Thomas Whitfield. I had it painted in colours I had always wanted, sage green in the bedroom, a warm terracotta in the living room, a deep navy in the small room I turned into a study. Renee helped me hang pictures. Kevin built me a bookshelf. My granddaughter, Lily, who was 7, declared that the sage bedroom was the best room she'd ever seen in her whole life, which is the best review any room has ever received. I enrolled in the accounting courses I put down 42 years ago, online at my own pace because I could. I joined a book club that met on Tuesday evenings at a coffee shop on Lexington Avenue. I started a garden on the condo's balcony, tomatoes and herbs and one very stubborn rosemary bush that did better than I expected. I travelled. Renee and I took a trip to Charleston that we'd been vaguely discussing for a decade. Kevin and I went to the Smoky Mountains for a week in October and hiked more than I'd hiked in 30 years. I went to a conference in Washington, D.C., on women's financial literacy, which sounds dry but was one of the most alive I'd felt in a long time. Rooms full of women who had learned, in various ways, that knowing your own financial picture is not optional. It is survival. Thomas's situation settled into something quieter and smaller than his old life. He sold the Charlotte house. It had to be liquidated as part of the asset division, and moved into a rental near the Ballantine area. He took a consulting position with a smaller firm, making significantly less than he had before. The civil suit from his old company settled out of court. Kevin saw him once at a family gathering and said he looked fine, older, a little deflated. He sent me a letter about 8 months after the final judgment, handwritten, which surprised me. He said he'd spent a lot of time thinking. He said he knew he'd been wrong. He said he was sorry, not in the way I needed early on, but in a way that seemed to have cost him something to write. I read it twice. Then I put it in a drawer and left it there. Not because I was angry. I passed through angry and come out the other side. But because an apology, however genuine, doesn't restore 41 years. It doesn't give you back the accounting degree you deferred, or the years you ran another person's life at the expense of building your own. It acknowledges a debt it can't actually pay. What it can do is close a chapter. I think that letter closed it. One Sunday afternoon last spring, I was on my balcony with a cup of coffee, and my rosemary had finally started to look like it intended to stay. The mountains were doing what mountains do in April in Asheville, which is look so unreasonably beautiful that you have to put down whatever you're holding just to look at them properly. I thought about the woman who had sat at a kitchen table in Charlotte with a folder she was supposed to sign by Friday. I almost don't recognize her. Not because she was weak. I don't think she was weak. I think she was tired. And there is a difference. But she believed that 41 years of partnership meant something legally, structurally, in the language of deeds and accounts. She had never thought to verify it. She had trusted. I don't regret the trust exactly. But I've made my peace with the lesson. Know what you own. Know what is in your name. Know your financial picture the way you know your own address. Because the day may come when someone challenges your right to your own life, and you will need to be able to answer clearly. I'm telling you this not to frighten you, but because no one told me, and I wish they had. I am 72 years old. I live in a sage green bedroom with mountain views. I am learning accounting, officially, finally, and I am better at it than I expected. I tend my rosemary. I have lunch with women who make me laugh. Last month I took a cooking class on a whim and discovered I've been making bechamel wrong for 40 years, which I find genuinely funny. I am not who I was in that kitchen with the folder. I am, if I'm honest, someone I like considerably more. Thank you for spending this evening with me. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it. You never know who might be sitting somewhere tonight, wondering if it's too late to fight back. It isn't. It really isn't. This is Sarah. I'll see you in the next one. I've thought a lot about what made Thomas believe he could slide that folder across the table and walk away clean. I don't think it was cruelty exactly. I think it was something more ordinary than that. He had watched me defer for 41 years, and he had mistaken patience for passivity. He had mistakiness for surrender. And when a person mistakes those things long enough, they stop seeing the person in front of them at all. They see a variable they've already calculated. That miscalculation cost him everything. There's a version of this story where I sign on Friday, where I take the $1,400 a month and find a small apartment somewhere and spend the rest of my life feeling like a footnote in my own history. I came close to that version. I sat at that kitchen table at 2 a.m. and I genuinely considered it, because fighting felt enormous, and I was tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone. That tiredness was real. I want to be honest about that. What pulled me back wasn't courage. Not at first. It was something quieter. It was just the refusal to let a lie go unchallenged. Thomas had built a story in which I was the woman who hadn't contributed anything that mattered. No paycheck, no title, no quantifiable output. He had found someone willing to agree with that story, and together they had made plans based on it. And something in me, some part that had been watching and managing and paying attention for 4 decades, said, that story is wrong, and I am the only one who can correct it. So I did. What I've come to understand, sitting on my balcony in Asheville with the mountains doing their unreasonable April thing, is that what happened to Thomas was not punishment handed down from somewhere outside him. It was just the natural consequence of his own choices arriving on schedule. He chose to conceal. Raymond found the concealment. He chose to threaten. Carol filed it as evidence. He chose to underestimate me. I used that. Every decision he made to protect himself created a new piece of documentation. Every attempt to intimidate me made the judge's eventual ruling more pointed. He built his own case against himself, one careful deception at a time, and I simply have the presence of mind to let the record speak. I think about Renee and Kevin showing up. Renee with her careful questions, Kevin on a plane from Denver with a duffel bag and no hesitation. I did not raise them to take sides, but I raised them to recognize injustice when they saw it, and they did. That is not a small thing. The people you build over a lifetime of showing up are who you have when everything else falls away. What I want to say to anyone who is sitting where I was sitting, at a kitchen table, very late, with a folder you're supposed to sign by Friday, is this: the fear is real, and the tiredness is real, and no one is going to tell you it's easy. But you are not required to accept a story someone else wrote about your worth. You are not required to make peace with a lie just because fighting the truth is inconvenient for everyone around you. Know what is yours. Know what your name is on. Know your own financial picture, not because you expect betrayal, but because that knowledge is yours by right, and no one can take it from you if you already hold it. I am 72. I have a rosemary bush that finally decided to cooperate. I am learning, officially and, at long last, the accounting I set aside in 1982 for a man who later told a judge he'd been generous. I know my worth now. I knew it then too. I just finally said so out loud.